There's been a lot of discussion about what is the root cause of inceldom and the overall male desperation in the millennial and zoomer dating and mating market. Most people gravitate towards the lookism, face now a mess, black pill worldview, but I think it's too simplistic to fully explain what's happening. Not only are we dealing with an explosion of inceldom across the West, but it's actually dramatically worsening as time goes by. That recent video of that woman trolling all of those men on Tinder, over 100 men, and then them staying there and competing for this one average-looking woman, is a singular event that kind of typifies what's going on in the West right now. And I think this goes further than just looks. I mean, I think we're dealing with a demographic issue as opposed to something socio-political or biological. And I think it really comes down to there being too many men competing for too few women. And the thing is, we don't have an issue like in China or in India where we have sex-selective abortion and men being excessively selected over women by their parents, resulting in a demographic imbalance. That's not what's happening. What I think is happening is that you're seeing an inversion of the population pyramid due to the aging population. One of the first proofs I have of this are the stats showing a stark difference in single men versus women when you compare them by age cohort. If you look at the share of US adults who are single, which I'm going to pop up on the screen, you'll see that over 50% of young men are single between the ages of 18 and 29. Whereas for women, it's under 1/3, it's 32%. And you might think, well, perhaps this is because older men are poaching these younger women. You know how most of the MGTOWs cope about this, and they'll say, well, it's because all of these women are washed up, nobody actually wants them after 35, so they're all getting poached by the older men who are all money maxed and bullshit like that. But if you look at the stats, that's not what we see. In fact, it's the other way around. Women are actually less likely to be single between the ages of 30 and 49 than they are to be single between the ages of 18 and 29. Whereas with men, what you see is men ages 30 to 49 are almost half as likely to be single as men ages 18 to 29. This isn't just an artifact of the differences in the dating and mating market, I think. Not alone. Because if you compare the next cohort up, of men ages 50 to 64, 27% are also single, right? So that means the majority of men, 73%, are with someone. Whereas if you compare it to women, 50 to 64, it's 29% of women are single, and that's almost identical. So if we consider that men almost universally tend to date women younger than themselves, typically from their age down to roughly about 5 years younger than them, you can show the rough dating pool for a man in a given age cohort using the population pyramids that are separated by 5-year blocks. What you do is you take the male bar. It's rather arbitrary where you start this. I typically start it at the age right before men start dying in significant numbers more than women, which is typically around the 70-year mark. And I overlay it on top of the female bar 5 years younger than them. And then you take the women or the men left over, whichever one is larger, and you subtract them from the same age male or female cohort, respectively. So in the case of a natural population pyramid, where each generation is in absolute numbers larger than the previous generation, you will have an excess of women in each population cohort. And you can take that excess of women and subtract them from the male population in their own age group. And then you take that group of men, subtracting the extra women from their own age group, and you overlay them onto the bar of women that are 5 years younger than them. And then you repeat the process. And eventually you'll find that you can create a kind of ratio, men that are competing for women 0 to 5 years younger than them. And it follows down. And it is essentially a pyramid scheme, if you think about it. Because as long as you have a constantly growing population, you can offset extra women that are taken, for example, in a traditional society that has like polygamy, like a medieval Islamic society. You can actually account for those missing women by taking them from the next generation that comes down. Because in absolute numbers, they're always going to have more women than men that are somewhat older than them, that are competing for them. This is what you see in countries where there has been a reduced female population. You see an increase in the difference of average age of marriage between men and women. And the average age between the two spouses increases when there's a demographic issue, like there's not enough women. And as a result, you can actually offset that. And this is what I think is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, where there is still widely practiced polygamy. You have to explain why there's widely practiced polygamy, but you don't have constant uprisings and constant, chaos. I mean, these countries are not stable, I'm not saying that, but you don't see gender-based craziness like what we would expect, right? And I think this is because they have such a high birth rate that they can offset all those extra women being taken by the men that marry those extra wives, producing a large number of children, many of them female. And studies have also shown that the gender ratio at birth, which is typically about 1.05, that actually increases to about 1.08 when you have only one child. But each successive child that you have after one child, the ratio goes down, approaching 1-to-1. And I think this is also partly explaining the gender ratio problems in a lot of Western countries because of the declining birth rate. I think if you look at countries that have younger populations, that means that there's more younger women and there's less competition by older men for those women. You're going to have a better overall situation for men in general. So if you look at countries like the Philippines or various Latin American countries or other young countries that have a young population, you don't see the kind of problems that we're dealing with in the West in these countries. And I do believe that is entirely due to the demographic situation being far better, even in countries where sexual morality is not heavily policed. Like, for example, the Philippines is more conservative than Western countries, but it is not in any sort of absolute sense a conservative culture, right? Like, there's a lot of prostitution. If you're a Westerner, you can get a girlfriend and you can fornicate with her. It's not going to be a problem, right? However, you don't have all of these incel men running around complaining about the situation in the Philippines. And this is because it's such a young population that there's a lot of women to go around, right? So if you're being outcompeted for women in your own demographic, you can just look 5 years younger or a few years younger, and you will find that there's even more women than the men that are competing for them. And then it continues. As I said, it is something of a pyramid scheme where you have a young population and then you're able to perpetuate this by producing more children. And this isn't anything scientific, but it's more of a visual experiment to show a trend in the ratios of men to women that are being competed for. That's really what's important here. It's not the actual numbers. If we were to do this in like some kind of scientific level, there would be a much more clear gradient and slope. But I still think it's useful to explain a trend, right? Because as I said, if the average man is between 2 to 5 years older than the woman that he's pursuing, it makes perfect sense that an inverted population pyramid will increase the competition for women compared to vice versa. I mean, you can use basic logic to come to the same conclusion. You don't even need to have this visual representation. But I do think it's useful to demonstrate exactly how this trend over time has affected the dating and mating market in the United States. If you compare the United States just within the last 50 years, you can see that there is a significant difference in the ratios for the age of when men and women are supposed to be pairing off, between the ages of 18 and 35. You can see that the ratio is getting smaller and smaller. And what's most interesting is that this isn't taking into account the racial demographics and the racial changes. If you look at non-Hispanic whites, the population pyramid is almost inverted. It's almost upside down with a bulge of millennials in the middle. Whereas if you look at Hispanics, it is a much more natural shape. And what is very curious is that you are seeing a large number of specifically white men that are going after women of other races, whether we're talking Hispanic women or East Asian women, even black women to a certain extent, though that's still quite rare. But you do see this male-led push towards miscegenation. It's not just because, white women are difficult to deal with. There's just more of these women of these different races in the demographic pool that men have to choose from, right? And there's less competition for them because of the shape of their population pyramid. So like poaching Hispanic girls is, it's just a lot easier than having to compete for white girls, where there's so many more men of different age brackets, whether we're talking men in their 30s down to men in their 20s, who may have a lot more money than you, who may be better looking than you, taller than you, who knows? But they're all competing for this same smaller and increasingly shrinking pool of women. So therefore it's a lot easier just to go after women of a different race. And I think this is what's happening in the United States right now. And you can also see this if you look at the statistics concerning inceldom broken down by race. You can see that women of other races, their rate of celibacy has been going down steadily since pretty much the data has been collected, but especially since the 2010s. What's being measured here would be any woman that's not white and not black, essentially, is what's being measured by other here in this context. And you can see that men are actually going up parabolically, while the women are going steadily down to almost zero. They're now below white women and black women. And white men are also increasing parabolically, but it's at a much slower rate. And I believe this is because white men are supplementing the missing women with women of other races. And this is disproportionately affecting those men of those same races. Having a demographic imbalance due to this inverted population pyramid is not in and of itself going to cause things, but what it will do is it will massively exacerbate existing problems. In the United States, one of the biggest problems is that boomer men divorced their wives in their 20s and 30s and then remarried Generation X or younger boomer women who were on the receding end of the population pyramid. And this put additional pressure on Generation X men. And it is interesting that if you look at when geomaxing phenomenon started to grow and develop, and when it really took off was the 2000s, the early 2000s. And yes, a lot of it was boomer men going to like Southeast Asia and the Philippines and stuff, but a significant number of them were Generation X men that were doing this. And I have a feeling this migration push was significantly exacerbated by baby boomer men who were making far more money than Generation X men, cucking them and taking their women. I think that's essentially what happened to them. And with millennials, this trend continued, right? Because you have to find those missing women somewhere. So they would then dip into the next generation's dating pool, right? And from there, millennials are now starting to poach if they, it's getting very difficult now. We all know how difficult the dating market is, but millennial men are starting to poach in significant numbers Zoomer women. And the problem with Zoomer men and younger millennial men, the millennial men that are born from the 1990s and later, where they're part of the smaller third of that population bulge, they are in a situation where they have no one to choose from because there's no children being born because of how damaged the economy is, because of how bad things have gotten, like the relations between the sexes, because of how pessimistic people are towards having children, especially women, how anti-fertility women have become. Generation Alpha, which is the generation after Gen Z, there's hardly any of them. If you look at the statistics, there's hardly any of them. They're just not being born. And the worst part about this is that this leads to a death spiral, because when you have fewer and fewer people being born in each successive generation, that means specifically fewer and fewer women being born. And women are the limiting factor when you are talking about population growth and fertility, right? So if you have fewer in absolute numbers, then you're going to have fewer children. Even if they, as a cohort, had more children, just due to the fact that there's less of them in absolute numbers, the overall population cohort that they will give birth to is going to be smaller. And this compounds on top of itself. So it becomes like a population death spiral. So it's very bad news, guys. Very bad news. Very pessimistic as far as the West goes, because we've had this situation for 50 plus years now, and it's not going to reverse itself. I think there was a chance for millennials to reverse it, but that has obviously been blown. The birth rate for them is catatonic. It's terrible. So this is just going to keep getting worse and worse, guys. And this is, as I said, this isn't necessarily causing things to happen directly, but it's exacerbating issues like feminism, simping, OnlyFans, hypergamy, all this shit. Like, all of this shit is feeding off of the demographic overlay that we're dealing with. If we had more women competing in the same market, you would be able to deal with issues like simping and hypergamy because you could just pick another woman, right? It's almost market forces at work, right? Supply and demand. Because the supply is lower and it's increasingly getting lower and lower, demand is rising, and these women can now make additional demands of their own, right? This is what is happening here. And this is also why I think women are totally blind to the situation, because you notice that they just don't care. They don't have any conception of the situation being terribly wrong the way that men do. And that's because they are the beneficiaries, the direct beneficiaries of the drought of women in the market. Like, if you're the one making money hand over fist in a deflating economy, you're not going to notice anything going wrong because your value, your stocks just keep going up. So it's really quite blackpilling, because I don't really see a way out of this, at least for the West. This is my thesis, that it's not just that there are more men than women, which is something that First talks about in his documentary, but I think we should dig into the specifics about it and make arguments based on this demographic data we have now and the statistical research that has been done on singles versus couples. And we can find what is going on. It's in the data here. I think that's all for now, guys. I'll talk to you all later.